Okay, so maybe St. James is a racist symbol of colonial domination, but does it matter? Recently, there's been a lot of discussion about statues and what is and isn't appropriate to display in public spaces. Generally, some people say this statue or that statue is of a slave owner or a Confederate general and we shouldn't honour them, and another set of people say this is part of our history and culture and we shouldn't forget it. This generally breaks down across political lines. The left wing is woke and part of cancel culture, and the right wing is against those things. Recently, in my own country, the UK, lots of statues of former slave owners have been removed. For example, the statue of Edward Colston was removed from Bristol and replaced with a statue of a Black Lives Matter protester. Colston was a member of the Royal African Company from 1680 to 1690, a period in which it is estimated that the company transported roughly 84,000 African men, women and children to the Caribbean and the rest to the Americas, of whom as many as 19,000 may have died on the journey. He also supported and endowed schools, houses for the poor, almshouses, hospitals and Anglican churches in Bristol and London. He was a very generous philanthropist for his time, and it is for these good works that the statue is erected to him. It was intended to commemorate his generosity, not his involvement in the slave trade, which was not controversial in his life. The slave trade wouldn't be abolished till the Slave Trade Act of 1807, more than a century after he was involved in the business. I'm not saying we shouldn't take down the statues of slave traders, but I am saying that to me St. James is actually more offensive because his statues were erected specifically as an insult to a conquered people. I think it's very telling that when Cortes asked Montezuma for permission to put a Christian altar in Tlatelolco, he said it would be dedicated to the Virgin Mary, the least offensive aspect of his faith. But when he took the city by force, they actually built a church to St. James, the most offensive aspect of his faith. I've been over almost 2,000 years of history, and I can't think of a single positive attribute represented by St. James, and yet he's called a saint, and people are expected to literally bow down and worship before him. First, let's talk about Cortes. Even 500 years after the conquest, Cortes is a controversial figure. This statue shows Cortes with a lion symbolizing Christian Spain and Malinche with an eagle symbolizing Mexico, with their child symbolizing the joining of the two sides. Shortly after the statue was erected in Mexico, there were protests and demonstrations against this statue, and it had to be taken down and essentially hidden somewhere obscure. Someone later broke off part of the child part of the statue. This all happened in the 1980s. In Spain, there's another statue of Cortes, which seems intended to be more offensive, if anything. The pose, with Cortes standing on the head of a decapitated Aztec chief, is rather provocative. I think it's supposed to be an Aztec idol, but it's still super offensive. In 2010, the statue was vandalized with red paint, presumably to symbolize the blood, and the vandals left leaflets saying the statue was a cruel and arrogant glorification of genocide and an insult to the people of Mexico. An online petition to remove the statue has 1,187 signatures, so at least some people object to this. I think both statues are offensive in subtly different ways. How offensive a statue is depends not just on what the statue depicts, but also the context in which the statue is displayed. A statue of George Bush in Washington, D.C. would be less offensive than the same statue in Mosul, Iraq. The ostensibly less offensive statue of Cortes was located in Mexico City, making it possibly more offensive than the statue in Spain. So, with that context, how have the statues and images of St. James been handled? As far as I can tell, there haven't been any proposals to remove the icons of St. James from Mexican churches, or any demonstrations calling for this. Interestingly, a statue of St. James trampling his enemies was removed from the Church of Santiago de Compostela. However, after a conservative backlash, the statue was returned to its place and remains there today. The story here is a bit complicated. You see, the statue was removed after the 2004 Madrid train bombings, a terrorist attack perpetrated by Islamic fundamentalists. Removing the statue was intended as a gesture towards repairing community relations, and amid concerns it might be a focal point for further attacks. This prompted an immediate and fierce backlash, and the statue was promptly returned to its place. A spokesman for the church said, "One should not seek to demolish any historic masterpieces just because of an unfortunate event. No Muslim imagines Mecca being demolished just because it might offend non-Muslims." Now, I do understand a desire not to make concessions to terrorists, but to me this profoundly misses the point. It's not about whether these symbols are offensive to Muslims, although they absolutely are, but it's really that these symbols are offensive to Christians, because this isn't in the Bible, and the Bible says the exact opposite. I think it's a bit unfair though, because in my view, there are stronger arguments the pro-Santiago side might have used, and I don't want to straw man them, even if they're sort of straw manning themselves a bit here. So let's look at the arguments on both sides in the intellectual battle of our age, the pink-haired lefty liberal social justice warrior versus the suited and booted pillar of the patriarchal establishment, as they pertain to St. James, on the question, should we cancel St. James? St. James is a racist symbol of colonial domination intended to terrify people into submission and shore up white Christian hegemony. This altar depicts events that are not in the Bible and in fact directly contradict all the lessons in the Bible. This is the dictionary definition of heresy. The definition of heresy? Well, I didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition. So much for the tolerant left. It was only a matter of time before cancel culture got so out of hand it was literally siding with the Spanish Inquisition and, of course, glossing over and misrepresenting history to do so. You mentioned that people were burned at the stake for refusing to renounce their indigenous beliefs. People like Carlos Omechotzin. He was burnt at the stake in 1539 on the orders of the first Catholic Bishop of New Spain for continuing to practice his pre-Hispanic religion. That's terrible! Why are you even telling us this? This is not helping your argument. It's not as simple as this. The pre-Hispanic religion he practiced included human sacrifices. He committed one human sacrifice and was warned that if he did it again, there would be severe consequences. And then he did it again. He killed a second sacrifice victim to honor his gods, so he had to die. This was justice. Omechotzin was burned for his crime and as a warning to others. He wasn't an innocent man sacrificed to the gods like his victims. Maybe you don't like the altars to St. James, but the Aztec altars were grim indeed. They stank like a slaughterhouse. They were caked in blood. In fact, the smell was so bad that the conquistadors struggled to enter the Aztec temples without vomiting. The Aztec priests never washed. They had long, matted hair caked in dried blood from their sacrifices. Thousands of victims were marched up the temple steps, had their hearts cut out, and were sent tumbling down the side to be eaten because the Aztecs also practiced ritual cannibalism. These stories were thought to be exaggerated by the conquistadors, but the discovery of Aztec Tzompatli, skull racks, where the sacrificial victim skulls were kept, shows there is at least some truth to these stories. I have a theory, and this is a bit off topic, that it was Tlacaelel who supercharged Aztec human sacrifices. So, Tlacaelel was the son of the Emperor Huitzilopochtli, and he was never emperor himself. Instead, he was the second in command, called Chichicoatl, to 4 emperors, and was probably more influential than the emperors he served because of his experiences and the connections he had gained as an army commander and running the state. It was during this period that the Aztec Empire expanded enormously. Tlacaelel burned the books of the conquered peoples, and he rewrote the Aztec founding mythology to emphasize the Aztec status as the chosen people, and also emphasize the importance of regular human sacrifices. The version of Aztec mythology that we have largely comes from his version. Human sacrifice had always been a feature of Mesoamerican religion, but there's considerable evidence that Tlacaelel focused on this and really increased the number of sacrifice victims. This served a political purpose for Tlacaelel, because capturing enemy warriors for sacrifice was a key goal of Aztec warfare. By writing a mythology in which human sacrifice was necessary to give the sun the power to rise and move through the sky, Tlacaelel also built a religious motive into the religion to drive more war and gave himself a mythology to use to motivate his soldiers. This is like a permanent crusade that never ends, because the crusade was to capture warriors to sacrifice, not for territory or material wealth. The Aztec need for sacrificial victims was so intense that they would organize so-called flower wars with neighboring states, where both sides agreed to hold a battle at a given time and a given place with a certain number of warriors, and there was no territory or gold at stake, just that the victors would be able to sacrifice the warriors they captured. To be sure, women and children were also sacrificed in some ceremonies, but the majority of sacrificial victims were enemy warriors. It wasn't long before all the other native groups around the Aztecs had surrendered to them and agreed to pay an annual tribute rather than fight them in their nightmarish wars. The Aztecs became the most powerful group in the area, although their hellishly violent religion was definitely one reason that so many other groups were ready to turn on them and ally with Cortés when he arrived, making the conquest possible. Cortés's victory was not just a matter of the Spanish fighting the native people, it was more that Cortés's arrival changed the balance of power in the region, enabling a civil war to start in the Aztec Empire. During the conquest, native groups fought each other, and Spanish armies under different commanders also fought each other. When Cortés marched on Tenochtitlan, he commanded an army of around 1,200 Spanish soldiers, and an estimated 200,000 native soldiers marched with him from regional allies. The native allies outnumbered the Spanish army by almost 200 to 1. In any case, the conquest is a really complicated story. It might be true that St. James is not the best of Christianity, but he's still much better than the Aztec religion. Truly, no religion has ever been more vile and deserving of eradication than the religion of the Aztec Empire. History is messy, and we can't expect the people and the actions of the past to meet present moral standards. We should still remember them and not attempt to sanitize our past by erasing anything that doesn't meet our modern sensibilities. Maybe so, but this is a church, not a history lesson. We have a duty to uphold higher moral standards. After the conquest, it was hard to explain Christianity to the native people. There were forced mass baptisms, and according to Bernardino de Sahagun, it was common to give the native people a one-to-one translation of our Christian gods and symbols to their native counterparts, as explaining the complicated Christian theology was very difficult, especially with very few interpreters and almost no literative Nahuatl speakers. The native people were told that St. James was the Spanish equivalent of Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec god of war. Are the people who bowed their heads before this altar because they believed they were worshipping the Christian version of the Aztec god of war, Christians in any meaningful sense? Look, here's what it comes down to. Who the hell appointed you, an English atheist, as the spiritual defender of Mexican indigenous people and an arbiter of Catholic doctrine? You have no stake in any of this. You're not Mexican, you're not Spanish, you're not Catholic, you're not even Christian, and you're literally just one guy. We can't build our public spaces to be so anodyne that no one in the world could ever take offence. If we did remove everything that offends anyone at all, we'd all be condemned to live life in beige rooms full of white walls. In summary, I sort of have to agree with that. If there was a widespread movement to get rid of St. James, I'd be on board, but if it's just me, then St. James stays. Besides, this ugly medieval painting inspired me to do a year's worth of research and to make this video. It is literally the most inspiring artwork I have ever seen in my life. Here is an altar in Mexico depicting a man who died in Israel 2,000 years ago, fighting a battle that never happened 1,200 years ago, symbolically representing the military power of Spain, a country he never visited, and a battle that very much did happen here 500 years ago. I mean, that's amazing! And what does this say about humanity and our religions? What does it show us about our power to believe contradictory things at the same time? To believe Christianity is a religion of peace, while also believing it's a religion of war? The whole story is somehow too perfect. How is it possible that this disciple of Jesus, depicted riding into battle, is the disciple Jesus explicitly told not to do this? How is it that the Spanish chose him to be their patron saint when he's the only disciple who dies in the Bible, so could never have come to Spain? I mean, how did that happen? If this altar to Santiago was taken down from the Church of Santiago de Tlatelolco and the church was rededicated to St. Paul, I would feel a sense of relief, but also a profound sense of loss. If great art is supposed to provoke an emotional response in us, then I have never seen a greater artwork than this. It has honestly moved me to tears. I've had to re-record this audio multiple times because I keep crying. There is nowhere on earth that this altarpiece would have more symbolic power than it does here in the Church of Tlatelolco.